Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Thanks for joining us. A lot of familiar faces in the audience, and it looks like a lot of new faces too. So, we're changing up the format a little bit today. We have Dee Smith with us. We're going to run through an interview with Dee, which is a little different. We're going to step back and take a look at the world at the macro level instead of the kind of the micro level that we usually look at in terms of compliance and hacks and things of that nature. So, been pretty excited for this talk. Couple kind of admin items first. As always, there's going to be the Q&A panel there. So if anything comes up, please type it in there, and we're going to address questions here at the end after Dee guides us through the topic. Also, just a quick note: I've been having internet outages here at the location, so I've got a backup system in place. If I go blank, give me about a minute, and I'll be back up and at them. Dee's over in Fort Worth, our neighbor here in Dallas. I don't know if y'all are having similar internet issues, Dee, but we've been having them on and off here. So, Dee, I feel like we're honored to have you. It's almost easier to talk about things that you haven't done than things that you've done. You're the CEO of Strategic Insight Group. You've been doing that for about 25 years. You've done some intelligence contracting work for DIA. You're the chair of the Benton Latin American cultural thing. You got the member council of foreign relations in New York, the Chatham House in London, member of Bretton Woods Committee in DC. And you're what I would call a true polymath. You just have something to bring just about every topic. And one of the reasons, so I started doing some contracting work for Dee a couple years ago, and we've worked on a couple projects together, and it's been incredibly interesting doing that work. And through that, I got to know Dee. He's also a publisher of I think it was a 5-part series on PBS documentary, A World on the Brink, which is an incredible watch. But Dee has a viewpoint that I think is worth sharing at the macro level. And for my audience, we talk about a lot of the 5 things that kind of drive our industry and the things that we have to look at in involvement. There's the economic cycle, what's going on with stocks and bonds, the internal conflict, Republican versus Democrats, external conflict, U.S. versus China, U.S. versus Russia. There's climate nature. We dealt with a pandemic that changed a lot. Dee, I feel like you're a incredible source on that we'll talk about. And then the 5th force is human inventiveness. And I think that's what we'll talk a lot about today, in particular, AI and quantum computing and how global change and all of this really at the macro level affects everything that we're going to be doing in the finance industry in terms of cybersecurity. Everything changes. And I'm sure Dee is going to touch on multiple categories, throughout that. So with that, Dee, I'll turn it over to you. I appreciate you being here. I'm super excited to have this conversation.
Well, it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. And yes, you're right. We have a long history of working together, which has been great. But my first time to appear on your podcast, and I'm honored to be here. So please ask me questions, but I'll start with a little bit of an opening. And that is that I think we're truly at a watershed moment. We're at a time in which multiple elements have come together, all of which are changing at an extremely rapid and accelerating pace, and all of which are pointing to a very different future than the recent past. And I think there are a few things that can help us to think about this and prepare for it. And the first one is to get rid of this idea that people call by different names. That some people call it near past bias, near term bias. Some people call it the problem of induction. If you're a philosopher, that's what you would call it. But the idea is that the near future is going to be like the recent past. And of course, that's never really true because things change, but it's particularly untrue these days. And, it's been pointed out that we're living in the first time in history when we really don't know what the job market, for example, is going to look like in just 10 years. We really don't know. And that creates huge problems, not only for young people starting out, but also for those of us who are in the middle of careers, and even for those of us who are past careers, because life is going to change so much. And so I think one of the things that leads to is to try to jettison assumptions in your thinking. And don't except to expect change. I think that our expectations are not well founded right now, because we simply don't know what's going down the pike. And as a CEO of a big corporation once told me, all conditions are temporary, which is, I think I had it on my wall for a while, and I told a client that, and the next time I came in, he had it on his wall. And it's a great thing to remember. All conditions are temporary. And it's more true now. It's more true every day than it was yesterday, and than it was the day before. So I think the third one of these things is skepticism. And I think that maybe is the most important, because I think it's incredibly important not to believe the things you hear, particularly in an age of deep fakes and misinformation and disinformation and propaganda and all these things that every country is now doing, and many non-state actors and private parties are participating in. And so it's more and more difficult to know what we're dealing with, and that brings its own set of problems. But an attitude of skepticism is our best defense. So, you mentioned a lot of these things that are coming up right now, that have to do with geopolitical, social factors, decline of faith in government, massive technological change, the birth of AI, which we can talk, quite a bit about. I think it's very interesting. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding out there about what it is and what it means. Climate change. Climate is changing, like it or not. We had the warmest year on record last year, and this has been the warmest quarter on record this year. And so, we're not in that scenario that a lot of people thought of. Well, it's in 2040 or 2050. It's happening now, and that's another massive vector of change. And that then connects to things like migration, movement of peoples, both internally within countries and externally between countries. It connects to resource issues, particularly food and water, but there are other resource issues too, like critical minerals and so forth. And it connects to social attitudes and concerns and violence and several other things. And so that's just a small set of this kind of hyper object, to use a recent term, that blends together so many things that you really can't even conceive of it all. But we can conceive of little parts of it, and we can look at the interconnections that we know. Often these interconnections are not even evident until something happens and we were, oh, wow, that was connected to this. We didn't know that. And then this was connected to that, which connects back to the first thing. And that's the kind of world we're living in. And so it is very confusing. It is very concerning. I hear people all over the world say, I don't even recognize my own country anymore. So it's not just an American phenomenon. And I think there is a lot of nostalgia that plays into this, and a lot of desire to be rid of these problems and turn them over to someone else who has simple answers, and people think, and also to recall the past in a way that is somewhat obvious, but in some ways not obvious, because we're in a new situation. So let me stop there and get your thoughts on all this. Or you're on mute or something. We're not hearing you.
I apologize, and we'll see how many times I do that throughout the webinar. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Okay.
But I think you're touching on all the points that I'm worried about. And I know when I think about my audience, they're sitting there and they're thinking like, we're in an industry that's changing very quickly, right? We have incredible economic headwinds, or at least an unknown in front of us. And in kind of what you said too, I mean, it's like, the future is the past, but there's things happening in our lifetime right now. I think quantum computing and AI I think in some ways you can look at this as we are in a new arms race, right? Like this is the new nuclear race that changed the world. This is the new industrialization that changed the world. We're on, I think the cusp of global change through these type of initiatives and these human incentives that are coming through. For me, the real concern, and I'm curious to get your thought on this. You're very much more a policy guy than I am, but how do we control this? Because when we look at things like AI, it seems to be really good right now, and you can help us with the misconceptions too, because I'm certainly no AI expert, but right now it seems to be doing a really good job at some of the minor, low-key tasks, customer service client type task, running chat bots, assisting with client service, which definitely affects low-level jobs. On the high end, to me, we don't seem like we're quite there yet. Like, yeah, we can use Chat GPT to code, but which I have to use because I'm a terrible coder. But when you actually use that, like it's still hard, right? Like it's not there. It's not fully automated. And I think the same with quantum computing. It really presents two challenges to us. On the one, it could potentially create life-saving medicines in a matter of seconds as it runs these calculations. And on the other hand, it also makes everything that we've done for encryption and privacy protection and data protection almost useless, and takes us back to sticks and stones in terms of how do we secure our client data. So, in just putting it in that perspective, I'm curious, how do we regulate these new industries that are popping up? Keeping in mind everything that we, because we do have climate problems coming on, and quantum computing could help with that. But how do we balance those risks on a policy perspective? And how do business owners think about those risks? And what do they monitor? And I guess I can go on and on with those questions, but those are really kind of the things that come to my mind when I think about how things are changing and some of the things that we've talked about before.
Yes, I mean, I agree with all that, and there's a lot to unpack there. And
Sorry,
I would start with, how do we? Your first question, which was how do we control this, and that's an extraordinarily knotty problem, and you may not like the answer, which is there are lots of parts of it that we simply can't control. And I think I'm just going to take a little aside here for a second, because I think that this question, how do we control this, or what's happening, is what leads to a lot of conspiracy theories on the left and on the right and elsewhere, because I believe that people would prefer to think that there's someone who is even against their interests but in control of it, than to believe that the bus is just careening down a road on the side of the cliff. And from everything I see, that latter is the actual situation. There is no one in control of it, and that's the scariest thing about it. But I think that people, it's more comforting to believe your enemies are in control than nobody's in control. So leaving that aside, the issues of technological change, I think, are in some ways the most profound. And we have to remember that technological change has always been a huge disruptor of society. The advent of the printing press led to 131 years of warfare in Europe, and the elimination of 10% or more of the population, and the downfall of a whole bunch of political and religious systems. Even before that, the advent of the plow, there's evidence that it displaced huge numbers of people because it made their jobs irrelevant. So, we're at another one of these nexus points where change is occurring very fast. But I think it's really important for people to understand what AI is and what AI isn't. And I'm just going to give a very simple illustration about what it is that artificial intelligence systems, particularly these so-called large language models like GPT-3 and GPT-4, what they do. And what they do is they simply calculate the most probable letters to follow the letters that they are given or generate. For example, the most probable, what are the most probable letters to follow these 20 letters in these 5 words? The capital of France is obviously Paris. And so they've learned these huge from these huge databases, almost all the internet, in fact, and can calculate that the probability distribution of those words, PARIS, is the most likely thing to come next. The system doesn't know what a capital is. It doesn't know what France is. It's just, what it's actually doing is cutting words into pieces. They call them tokens, and they're about 4 characters each if you're using English. And their tokens are just a word for the fundamental units of data that are processed by algorithms. And each one is a component of a larger set, and they just essentially put these things together in a probabilistic way. It's fancy statistics is what it really is. They don't have any awareness, and this is the thing I think that's so crucial. They don't, this gets into some fairly obscure things that were the domain of philosophers until very recently, and now they've become extremely important in the real world. AIs don't create what are called self-consistent models of the world, and they don't have any internal states, what is called in philosophy qualia. And qualia are the internal phenomenon of what it's like to have an experience. In other words, what is it like to see the color red? What is it like to be angry? What is it like to be hungry? Being aware of awareness. We all have that. AIs have none of it. And they can't have it because they have no systems within them that could possibly generate it. So, and added to that, we don't really understand how the human brain works, or even how animal brains work for that matter. We keep finding new structures within the brain, and we have no idea what they do, but they wouldn't be there if they didn't have some important function, because evolution wouldn't allow it. And, so we don't, all AIs are doing is this statistical approximation of what a certain kind of output of a brain looks like, but they're not looking at all the outputs or inputs into a brain. Another element is that I think that we need a sense of perspective on this, because, 40 years ago, if somebody had held up a little device the size of a deck of playing cards, basically, and said, this thing can tell you how to drive from Houston, Texas to Nome, Alaska, with every turn and how long it's going to take for each part and for the whole thing, we would have thought that was intelligent. But we don't think that way now. We don't think our phones are truly intelligent. So, it's a matter of perspective. And, error also abounds in AIs because they have to compress the data that they use. So it becomes very low resolution and blurry. And that's because the model is so much smaller. The program is so much smaller than the enormous data on which it's trained, which is basically all of the data in the internet. Say that as a shorthand. And so, they have to make each one of these tokens, these little segments of letters, have a non-zero chance of being chosen, because that's what allows AI to come up with new patterns and generate data, hence the term generative AI. But those elements are also what allow AIs and make AIs hallucinate data, because they have no way to check if something is actually accurate or not. And they intentionally make these these models contain data that is conflictive. They have data that conflicts with each other, and they even have ways to turn this up and turn it down. The AI researchers talk about changing the temperature of a model so that they can, if the temperature is like a dial, if it's turned higher, then the model's more creative, but it's more inaccurate, and if it's turned lower, it's less creative but slightly more accurate. And so what is it that AIs are good at? They're good at summarizing and at paraphrasing. They're quite good at generating, fakes of various kinds, particularly when they have a specific data set to use. And they are not good at all at research. And they can put together some novel concepts because they're random, but they're not good at research. What I think there was a very interesting and important observation made by the philosopher Daniel Dennett. And he said, these models can fool us into thinking they're sentient or conscious, but they're many decades, if ever, away from actually being sentient or conscious. But because they can fool us into thinking they can be used by bad players to manipulate us. And that, I think, is a real danger. And I think another real danger is that they are coming for white collar jobs, particularly the ones that are kind of pro forma, legal documentation and so forth. So it's not just the blue collar workers who, and by the way, 20%, more than 80% of the blue collar jobs lost in the last 20 years in the US have been due to automation, not offshoring. And so this is coming now for white collar jobs. So what are we going to do about that? I mean, I could go on, but let me stop there. And I guess there's one other thing I would mention, and that is that, there are non-computational aspects of reality, and AI simply can't handle them. And a lot of them are really important elements in mathematics. And there are things that can't be observed directly, like dark matter, dark energy, the whole quantum realm. And those are also very important. And so you have AIs deal with propositional statements, that are explicit, things that are believed to be known to be true. They don't have any of the, what John, what's his name, Vervaeke said, the 4 Ps of knowledge, that you have propositional, perspectival, knowing something from a certain viewpoint, procedural, movement oriented, how to drive a car, how to play the piano, how to catch a ball. The knowledge is in your muscles. And participatory, what is it like to participate in a debate, in a conference like this, in a band playing music, in a political process? AIs only deal with propositional knowledge, and they have no real sensory elements that sense their realities. So they are nothing like us in terms of what's actually happening, but they can fool us.
I think you did a pretty good job, at least unpacking most of what I was talking about there, and really solid stuff. And the cell phone analogy is great. I've actually never heard that one from you in the past, and I really like it because I think that resonates well with people where, tomorrow's technology looks like witchcraft today, where it's boring technology in the future. There's a couple issues here that I'm kind of, sensing. And in some ways you can say AI is dumb. It can be. And when you talk about skepticism, I think that a lot of firms who are going to choose to start using AI have to be really skeptical in place. And in kind of tying that into the SEC, my timeline's off here, but within the past couple of weeks, we saw a couple of fines go out for financial firms that were claiming to be using AI, and I think they weren't really, or kind of whitewashing what was going on with it. But it brings up a couple of different concerns. One, when we talk about internal conflict, we're at a period of huge populism in the US, right? It's left or right or wrong. They're willing to fight for what they want. And when, even though this is new in our lifetime, right, it's happened many other lifetimes, many times before. And when we look at these incidences, science and technology often kind of gets pushed to the side, and the people who are speaking up about it and saying, hey, building nukes is a problem, building AI, building, quantum computing is a problem. I think that kind of gets pushed to the side. So for me, to round that out, it was interesting to see the SEC finally step in and say, hey, look, we're not quite comfortable with firms saying that they're using AI and putting that in their literature because, like you said, it's basically running on statistical models. And I don't remember the exact problems of what happened with Google's AI bot when they released it, but similar to what you said, you would ask simple things, who was the last pope, and it would post up a picture of a Native American, in a tribal outfit. Like the answers completely didn't make sense.
I think
Was
it had
that?
female popes. So,
Yes. I knew it was something like
which
that. It
which
was
would be great from some people's perspective, but it's not actually what has happened. So,
right. And to make that even worse, when you look at things like what's going on in the tech world, Reddit just had an IPO, and when you really read into the value of this company, it's through selling its user database and selling the comments and the user boards that have gone on Reddit to feed these large language model, these artificial systems. So that's terrifying, right? Are we going to have AI based on the highest voted comment on Reddit, going forward with some of these models? So anyway, I think it's really interesting how it changes, who's going to regulate it and the type of problems that it's brought. I know even though it's still at an infancy level of what it's able to do, it's definitely a problem that people put trust in it. And through some of the attacks that we've discussed on here before, I'm already starting to work cases where AI is playing a critical role in business email compromise, because it can go through hundreds of thousands of emails within a company and figure out statistically, how does this company talk to each other? I've had one client where it fooled a CEO admin relationship of 26 years by speaking just like this CEO to the admin and ordering a wire transfer. So, I mean, there's all kinds of problems that are coming through with this, and not to mention, how does this open us up to our development with China and our trade with there and the international? It's just like everywhere you look, it spider webs out into a different problem. For firms that, I think it's troublesome, and I'm curious to understand, how firms rectify this. But, being a former Bridgewater alumni, I keep up with a lot of the research they're doing, and they're definitely bringing AI into their models and understanding how to model the world. And I think it's fair to say that the type of artificial intelligence models that a firm like Bridgewater is using is going to be very different from John and Pop, ABC Financial down the street, or even, kind of a mid-sized firm like Dimensional Funds in Austin, Texas, right? Like it's going to be deployed at all these kind of levels. And so I wonder if it almost stomps out the little guy in a lot of ways, if it's not regulated. Again, Dee, I'm just throwing a lot of things out there because, as you know from our past conversations, I think these are interesting topics that just that spider web all over the place. The last thing I'll kind of say, and we're starting to see it a lot. I see it in some of the documents that I have, but I have firms that are starting to use artificial intelligence to write their compliance documentation, and they think it's there. And then when you actually look at it, it's a disaster. I mean, it's almost made them worse because they're just tossing it into AI and really not taking any updates from that. So, these are all just the things that come to my mind. In terms of all of these issues, in your mind, what is the most pressing issue that really faces, that these financial institutions face in terms of regulation and in terms of security? How do they protect themselves from nation states like China, who might not regulate quantum computing and AI and absolutely destroy the protections that we put in place? How do we address that at the policy level?
Well, there's again a lot to unpack. They're all great comments and questions, and I'll start with your last issue: is how do companies and financial firms, large and small, protect themselves? And I think that there are some basic things that can be done, but I would call to everybody's attention first the idea of security theater. And that's an idea that's been around, 15 years or so. And what it means is that a lot of what's done to enhance security is theatrical. Doesn't really do anything in terms of enhancing security. It makes people feel better that they've, quote unquote, done something. And you and I both know that there are many instances of that. But given that, there are some basic things that, for example, there's the issue of air gaps. And a lot of companies have servers who are connected to the open internet through things like client portals and all that. And those servers also are either have or are connected to servers that have very critical, mission critical data and very sensitive data on both, things that the company has that are proprietary, and also customers and clients and so forth. And it's more trouble. But if you simply don't have a client, an open interface to servers that your company has, that's a level of protection, and it's called an air gap in the intelligence world. And is it perfect? No, nothing's perfect. But another general principle of security, and this applies to putting a burglar alarm on your house, is you make it difficult enough for people that they'll move on to the next target. And so and a third one is that you really can't secure systems, but you can do a better job of securing files. So they're going, if they want to get in your system, they're going to, and there are various reasons they may want to. And we can talk about that in a minute too. But if you make it difficult enough for them to actually get into the files, unless they have a specific reason, like they're directed by a nation state to do it, even if they're a non-state actor, unless they have a specific reason, they'll move on because it's too much trouble and time is money and so forth. So, those are common sense type things, but they get lost in the quest for efficiency. And, this is becoming a major theme, the difference between efficiency and robustness. And, we saw it in the pandemic, but we're seeing it again with things that are happening, within the Red Sea and shipping, and, the Panama Canal, which is not getting enough rain and it's becoming difficult to operate and so forth. And so people are changing the concept from just in time to just in case inventory. And of course, that increases cost because you've got to hold more inventory and so forth. So there is, another dial is between efficiency and security. And I'm not talking about just computer security, all kinds of security. So I think we're going to have to come to terms with the fact that costs are going up and are going to continue to go up. And there's a certain amount of inflation that is essentially structural now. Because of things like that, because of resources, demands from growing populations. We have demands from shrinking populations too, because they want more services, and the desire of everybody to live the lives that we've been fortunate enough to live in the West, and so forth. So, it's, and those things add to instability too. But I think companies are going to reach a fundamental point where they're going to have to decide, do we want to be more efficient, or do we want to be more secure? And, and this goes to something as simple as looking at the people you hire, or looking at the people who already work for you, and that's part of what we do in my company. We do a kind of vertical diligence. Sometimes we call it 360-degree intelligence. And part of it is who are you working with? Who's in your company, and what could they do? And you'd be surprised that if you take a company with, let's say, 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 employees, there's going to be 3 to 4%. You look at them all who are going to have real problems in terms of things they've done or might be likely to do. And they're detectable things, but people don't look at that because it's just easier to hire, and so there's this whole panoply of things that have to do with your question of how are these companies going to make themselves more secure, that don't even get into cyber attacks. And of course, that's a huge issue as well. Massive cyber attacks that are state sponsored or actually state actors doing them. And that's become an aspect of war. It's asymmetric because very small units, even individuals, can deploy it to sometimes. Another thing like that is bioterror. And then, of course, there's bioerror, things getting out because and we're now at the point where for a few $1,000s, at least a few tens of thousands of dollars, you can put in a garage CRISPR technology that will allow you to genetically engineer viruses and potentially come up with something that's devastating. So, I think to round back to another of your points, that science and technology are they're things that have become of great concern to people because they've seen all these predictions about utopias that are going to be created, and then what really happens is not that. Right. And this plays into the whole social, erosion of belief in the systems and the leaders, and that's not just the U.S. It's global. But I think another element that plays into this is the complexity of the world, and I think the complexity of the world is making people sort of deranged. I think it's just we weren't evolved to deal with that kind of complexity. We were evolved living on savannah, and yes, there were lots of threats, but it wasn't a complex environment like we deal with now. And I think that in turn is one of the factors that leads to populism and the appeal of authoritarian leaders, because they make the claim that they can solve things and they give simple solutions, and people are just at the point where they say, fine, take it, solve it. I don't deal with it anymore. And of course, it never works. And because you can't solve a complex situation simply, for one thing, and there are many other reasons authoritarian powers don't work. We could talk about that. But any event, so all of this stuff it's all of a piece. It's all tied together. And it's, there's a term that they use in the military quite a bit called a wicked problem. And that's a problem that is very difficult to solve. It intersects with other problems. Any solution is only partial and may make other parts of it worse, and so forth. And note what we have are a series of wicked problems in these hyper objects. So why wouldn't that kind of complexity make you deranged?
Absolutely. There's just so much, and like you said, it's a wicked problem. It intersects so many things, and we have a couple questions coming in here to the chat, so I would encourage people to put those in, and we'll get those addressed. Right. There's a couple things that for one, you mentioned insider threats, and I hadn't even brought that up yet. And when I'm working a case, or when I'm working a hack or some kind of threat that's occurred, there's been some kind of cyber incident, usually within about 3 or 4 hours of getting on that scene, I can look at it and say, this is an insider threat, or this was an insider case in some way. And that boils down to, malicious insiders, people selling secrets to China, people willing to give up access to your network on the dark web, to insider threats who don't know they're a threat. They accidentally shared a document public, that sort of thing. And insider threats are growing. I see it more and more. And you also mentioned nation states, and that's another one too that in security theater, and because I see a lot of that, and it's one of the reasons I simply don't work with security vendors, is because they do so much of this security theater and saying, they're protecting things, and then I'll do a webinar and show how just we walk right past that. Put an intrusion protection system in place. Who cares? We'll walk right past it. So there's a lot of the security theater, and with nation states and even the ransomware threat that goes on. This is a very, very simple problem to solve that no one wants to talk about. Encrypt your data and have backups. If you encrypt your data and you have backups, ransomware is not a threat. And anyone that tells you it is trying to sell you ransomware protection or some other protection. I am of the firm belief you simply can't protect yourself from nation states. Just like you said, if they want in, they will dedicate the time and the resources. For me as a consultant, and when I'm talking with my clients, I say, hey, look, we are going to take you to the level of security that's nation state. If a nation state wants to get in, they can, but your average hacker, it's going to take them 6 months. And knowing that, there's nothing behind the door, you don't have custody of assets, you're not doing Bitcoin mining or anything like that. just like you said, Dee, they're most likely going to move on to the next target. And the last thing I'll kind of kick off to you, and because I'm curious to see your input on this before we jump to some of the questions from the audience, but where are we in the world? Are we becoming more globalized? Are we in a period of deglobalization? Did we kind of wake up after COVID and realize, hey, look, maybe we shouldn't be selling data to China or harvesting data for China or all the things that we're doing, actually physical outsourcing of supplies, maybe we shouldn't do that. So I'm curious to get your opinion on where are we in that term? Are we becoming more global? Are we retreating? What does that look like in your mind? And then we'll kick off some of these questions from the audience.
It's a very complex and multi-layered question. And but my sense of it is that we're becoming less global, and I think that in some very specific ways, we actually woke up to it right before COVID. And I remember in 2018 having a briefing with someone who pointed out that the U.S. military had essentially, I think, almost woken up one day and realized that all the flat panel displays in U.S. fighter jets were made in China. Mm-hmm. And vulnerabilities that represents, both in terms of supplies that have to be replaced and in terms of what might be in those things. And that was one of the early signs of seeing that the vulnerabilities that we've created by being by outsourcing so much critical technology are enormous and growing. And so there has been a specific walk back of those things among the U.S. military. And then I think at the same time, corporate entities began to perceive that they were at risk too, not only, but certainly because of information theft, critical information theft, which happens all the time, but also, and I mean IP theft, but also because they were putting themselves in a position where they might have to change so fast that they couldn't easily deal with it. For example, having to withdraw from Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so there's, you have these terms nearshoring and friendshoring and so forth. There is a growing feeling that the world is reassembling itself into blocks or whatever you want to call it, spheres of influence, the classical geopolitical term for that. And becoming a multipolar, it's already become a multipolar power, but one with balance of power politics. And balance of power politics people will say, oh, it's great, they're actually extremely dangerous, because that's the way it was in the late 19th century. And everybody was jockeying for position and trying to get the balance a little more in their favor and less in their adversary's favor. And it led to World War I and World War II, and which I see as two bookends of essentially the same long war. So it is a much more threatening state than the bipolar order that we left at the end of the Cold War. And then there was this unipolar moment when it looked like the U.S. was predominant, but it was very short, just a decade or so, a long decade. And so, we're in treacherous waters now from the standpoint of geopolitical activities and geopolitical structures. And I think that what you're going to see is an increase in the creation of these blocks or spheres of influence where they trade internally, but they don't necessarily trade as much with each other. So that's factor number one. Factor number two is the astonishing growth of the need and desire for identity among people, and this is fracturing societies internally, and it's fracturing nations away from each other. I remember hearing someone in the UK before Brexit saying we would be happy to be measurably less wealthy in order to be measurably more British. And, that's not, and this was that person. Here's another one of these, funny dichotomies, funny, strange dichotomy. That person was conservative, what would now be called conservative. Yet the willingness to become less wealthy is not usually been seen as a conservative idea. So all these things, it's all shook up. It's all mixed. All these ideological camps are mixed up with one another, and they don't any longer make sense. Left and right don't really make sense any longer. And that would get to my third point on this, which is that these legacy systems, these incumbent systems, are no longer fit for purpose, I think. And I think that people are coming to that conclusion. We need new thinking and new ways of doing things, and nobody knows what those are. So you've got just a very, very dynamic, to use a positive word, but fractured and splintering, to use a more negative terms. You've got that reality in an increasing way. So everything's breaking apart from everything else. And to sum it all up, that does not lead to more globalization. It leads to less.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways we're starting to see that, and certainly the new administration, whichever way it falls, will play heavily into how that plays out in the future, I think.
Yep, I agree. And it's been very interesting to see that the Biden administration has really not changed the Trump approach to China at all. I mean, and that's one of the few areas on which you have bipartisan consensus in the U.S. and that is a anti-global development.
Why do you think that is? Is it a fear of China? Is it are we bowing down to China in some ways? Like, have we lost the arms race to them in some ways in our approach? And again, it's not the Biden administration, it's not the Trump administration, the Bush, the Clinton. It's not any of these to really point to. It's just this overall dynamic of how things change and how global powers change. Why are we not changing our policy with China, in your opinion?
Well, I think we made a huge policy change from being very open and very willing to engage with China at all levels of business, society, and politics to the opposite. So I think it's changed a lot in the last 6 or 7 years, and I think the reason for that change is a realization across the board that China, and when I say China, I mean Xi Jinping and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, not the people of China. And this is true across the board. The people of any given culture or country are usually misrepresented by their political leaders, whatever stripe and whatever system. But anyway, leaving that aside, I think people began to realize that China had stolen so much data that China's practice is to steal intellectual property. They would not have a working aircraft carrier if they hadn't managed to steal the U.S. Navy plans for aircraft carriers. That when you work with them, they assume you have to assume that you're going to give up your intellectual property to them if you're a commercial business or even an NGO or even a government. And they're incredibly aggressive, and they threaten their neighbors. They created a policy in the South China Sea that's not like any other country has in terms of what's theirs and what isn't. And so I think that the change has already occurred. And do I think that we're losing to them? Not really, not completely. I think they're becoming a peer adversary. And I think that, but again, skepticism is so important here because nations make claims for various reasons. And, I'll give you a specific example. China claims to have a hypersonic missile that is operational. And that means a hypersonic guided missile as opposed to a hypersonic ICBM, which is a ballistic and follows a certain pathway. They claim to have they claim to have an operational one that can be guided halfway around the world in an irregular pattern and strike an aircraft carrier or whatever. And Russia also claims to have one. It is not clear at all that those claims are accurate. The U.S. claims not to have one that works, and it's not clear that that claim is accurate either, because sometimes countries don't want you to think they have something that they have. So, you know, it's and this is going to play out over time. China has enormous internal problems. There is a growing anti-militancy in China. The population doesn't want to go to war with Taiwan or anybody else. There are enormous economic issues. There's a demographic problem that's almost impossible to solve unless they start letting in non-Chinese, which is the one-child policy in its aftermath. And they try to reverse that, and people don't want to have more than one child, and the one child doesn't want a brother or sister because they want to get everything. So, you know, it's just facing heavy sledding, as they say, in a whole bunch of ways. And not that the U.S. isn't too, not that Western Europe isn't in every country, but I don't think that China is this all-powerful behemoth that popular imagination has made it out to be. But I do think that our policy of whatever you want to, I mean, they don't use the word containment because that makes the Chinese see, more than red, white hot, that makes them, it's incendiary. But that's really what it is. And I think that's going to continue. You know, you've got all of China has no friends around it. And you've got, you know, the Quad, you know, India, Japan, U.S. and Australia. You've got the AUKUS, you know, which is U.S., Australia, and the U.K. You've got a much more active ASEAN, Asian, Southeast Asian nation agreement. You've got a new thing just in the last week of China and Vietnam coming together on some projects. So, you know, it's they're worried about China too. And so this is again a long answer to a simple question. I don't think China is or will be a massively more powerful nation than the U.S. unless we dismantle ourselves, which could happen, because of the internal strife in the U.S. I don't actually think, short of nuclear war, which is another issue, or something similar to that, some kind of massive, destructive event, I don't think anything can take the U.S. down except itself, its internal divisions. And I think that could, sadly. But maybe, hopefully it won't.
Agreed. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. And I think the next few years or even decade are going to be pivotal in U.S. history and, where we're heading as a country.
In global history.
In global history. Absolutely. Yeah. Switching gears a little bit, we'll throw it to a question from the audience. It says, in my experience, much of the AI conversation has centered around new tools, vendors, and services. What about existing services that are suddenly introducing AI elements into their current offerings? Microsoft and Adobe come to mind. Are SEC registrants disabling these add-ons, or are they developing new policies and procedures to address them? I'll kind of jump on that kind of quickly, just in terms of SEC compliance, and then Dee, I'd love to hear your opinion kind of on the global level. In terms of SEC compliance, in my opinion, if you are going to be using these tools, you definitely have to address your policies and procedures to outline how you're using them. Are you potentially feeding them client data? That's definitely something we need to understand. And understanding what exactly Microsoft and Adobe is doing to that data. For me, there's a larger privacy concern there that, that data could be lost or something. Adobe has certainly been victim to numerous hacks throughout the years. If you've ever been through an audit with us, we covered the Adobe hack a lot because it affected just about every one of my clients who use Adobe. So, there's kind of two issues there. Yeah, if you're going to use these type of services, ChatGPT, Microsoft, the Copilot, Adobe. I'm not quite sure what Adobe's calling it, but if you're going to be using these, they definitely need to be outlined in your policies and procedures manual, and also outlined in your employee technology usage agreements. So you need to have clear, defined ways that your employees are allowed to use these tools and how they're allowed to interact with clients. So those are kind of the two documents in terms of SEC compliance that come into my mind. But Dee, I want to kick this over to you too, because there is, this larger idea of, are we okay with companies like Microsoft, Adobe, Reddit, ChatGPT? I mean, they obviously collect some very, very intimate details about our clients, the data that we're using, that sort of thing. So I'm curious on, what do you think on a policy level? Should firms be trusting this software just yet, or is it too much of a we're putting too much trust in it and we don't quite understand what it's doing? In other words, maybe it's okay to correct a Word document with it, right? But we shouldn't be feeding it financial situations and asking for advice. So I'm curious how you think about
that. Again, a great set of questions and observations, and lots in it. I would start on your comment about privacy, because I think that's going to become another very virulent area of debate or dispute, because there is a group of people whose attitude can be summed up like this: my data is mine, and if it's used, I want to be paid for it. Of course, that's not the case now. And that may be addressable in litigation. It's already starting, in fact. And if that changes, it changes the entire dynamic of these things, the large technology companies, because, as you said, rightly, that's what they've based their whole model on, is the use of personal data and corporate data that they're not paying for, but particularly personal data. And that is it's a real threat to them, and it's a real threat to everybody else too, because their data is exploited that way. It's been observed, and I think correctly, that the reason Elon Musk wanted Twitter and was willing to pay a lot of money for it was because of the data array that's in it, and which he could use to train an AI. And so it's again, you've got to be skeptical of what people say their motives are and what people say they're doing, and that's not to single out Elon Musk. It's really everybody. But I think that in terms of how this is going to play out, the problem is that the government is so far behind the curve in understanding this and dealing with it. And that's partly because of the economics of it. The private sector will pay so much more than the government. And so, they're it's like one of these old comedies, where there's somebody who's inefficient and ill-equipped and, just goes through life bumbling and so forth. Unfortunately, that's the situation that we're in with a lot of the government. And they do attract some good people and then they leave. And so they have a problem with continuity. But there's also a whole cottage industry, more than a cottage industry, an underground industry, I guess, that you and I know about, but a lot of people don't, which has to do with zero-day exploits. And zero-day exploits are they're vulnerabilities in systems that people can exploit to hack those systems. And there are people whose business is to actually find those things and sell them. And there's an active market, and the going price, the last time I looked at it, is like $2 to $3 million per verified exploit. And governments participate, so do non-state actors and criminals. And the U.S. government, for example, lets it continue because it's useful. And so a government would buy those either to attack somebody else or to prevent or to find a way to close that door, and the reason they call it 0-day exploits is because the responders have 0 days to deal with it. It's a vulnerability within a system that's unknown, and then somebody finds it, and they don't use it. They sell it to somebody else, and then it's all very secret until that party uses it or uses it to defend against some other party who might use it. And it's very interesting how this is done. These things happen in meetings at coffee shops and that kind of thing. It's not done over the internet because that's too risky. So it's very much like old style espionage and so forth. So, that kind of thing, governments are, they're on the back foot because they don't have the skill sets to deal with those things. And that's why these things keep becoming crises. And so, how do you actually deal with this? I mean, it's a very difficult situation where you've got so much information that is undetected, that are flaws in software, hardware, firmware, whatever, and you have a market in it, and governments participate in it, but they don't necessarily dominate it. And that's the kind of thing that I think people just don't realize how vulnerable we are in this kind of situation.
Yeah, so it's spot on. I'm reading a book right now called "This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends." I forget the author.
Yes, I know that book. I haven't read it yet. Yeah.
It's an excellent book. I'm almost through with it, but it's just about 0 days, and it kind of walks through a lot of the Russian attacks that we saw in Ukraine and that sort of thing. But so there's all that going on, and I've talked about it in past webinars. There was an incident that very few people talk about, and our government certainly doesn't want broadcast more. But if you go to Google and search shadow brokers, you'll quickly understand what happened. A few years back, the NSA was hacked. This was after the Snowden revelations of everything that Snowden put out. The NSA was hacked by a group called the shadow brokers, and the shadow brokers sold off every tool that the NSA had. I mean, the deepest. So the NSA runs a group called TAO, Tailored Access Operations, and these were all the tools that Tailored Access Operations was using for our worst enemies. And those tools have been made available to everybody now, and because of that, the 0-day market has exploded, right? Because like you said, the 0-day market started out small. It actually started out with a businessman here in Texas buying a no-name firm up in DC for $10 and started paying hackers to turn over what they would find. Before anyone else, they would pay them a small fee and these hackers were happy because now they're getting paid for their work instead of potentially going to jail, right? There used to be no avenue for hackers to communicate with companies when they did find these vulnerabilities, and that led to a lot of problems. So, I mean, it's just the 0-day market and the shadow brokers. We're combining that with artificial intelligence, quantum computing. I mean, when I'm doing consultations, I always joke. People come and hire me, and they say, "Hey, how do we be the most secure?" And I buy a typewriter, a legal pad, and some pilot pens. That is
actually being done in some.
It is. It absolutely is.
Because if you type it out on an old-fashioned typewriter with no electricity in it, and you put it in a file and in a safe of some kind, then that's the most secure you can have. And even that, of course, is penetrable, but it's the most secure you can have. And you mentioned another thing, which was or alluded to the fact that these companies are making money by mixing and matching data and putting it together, and that's in fact what the intelligence methodology is. It's finding lots of little pieces of data, putting them together with certain tools and approaches, looking for patterns and anomalies, and revealing hidden information, things that people don't expect you to know, don't want you to know. And I mean, that is the intelligence methodology. And it's what my company does every day. We're the good guys, at least we hope we are, but we're helping, investors not lose money, and particularly large investors who are often investing on behalf of other people, like pension plans or funds and so forth, to avoid vulnerabilities. But that is what you just described, and it is being used to commercially exploit large groups of people, because when you put enough pieces of data together, you can tell the tale. And it's people don't realize that. They don't understand how much data is out there and how powerful certain approaches are in putting it together. All of it open source. I mean, we use things that have to do with human intelligence too, but you can do an astonishing amount with open source. And
Huge.
CIA has estimated that 90% of all data is out there somewhere in open source, just like the thing you were alluding to on Google, the shadow brokers. And so it's out there. You have to know how to look for it, but it's definitely an area that I think people don't realize. It's connected to cyber vulnerability, but it's not really cyber vulnerability. It's information vulnerability, and that's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, and we got a comment again from the audience that they agree privacy is it's a significant battleground issue that we're dealing with. Jumping back a little bit, and it says they're very eager to looking for a reckoning on this front, and I totally agree with them. We talk about security a lot, and privacy is a sidebar of that, and at some point I know a lot of my clients are going to be demanding privacy and be taken more serious, and having more extensive privacy policies and the way that data is sharing, that sort of thing. So Dee, I'll kind of kick it to you for some closing comments there, on privacy and just overall. I mean, we touched on so many issues, and I made note about the fighter jet issue. I remember reading about that too, with the displays that were in. I think they were actually finding data was being sent back. It wasn't so much, hey, it could be a vulnerability. Data was actually being sent back. So again, it's this hyper object wicked problem that you talked about, right? And I think it's only going to get bigger. So I'll kind of leave you with the closing arguments on that, and what's next, right? What do we do from here? I mean, there's just so many problems. Well,
thank you, and it's been great, and you asked fantastic questions, and what comes next? I mean, who knows? And one of the things that I think blinds people, again, to go back to what we talked about in the beginning, is believing that patterns always repeat. So I'll give you an example. There was most of the experts before Russia invaded Ukraine said they're not going to invade. It hasn't happened in 70 years. It's not going to happen now. And, it's just for show. Well, there was a group of us who said, wait a minute, you don't move all these troops across the largest landmass country in the world for show. And
300,000 strong across the largest landmass.
Yeah. If you read what he said, he's serious. And it's another thing. You read what Xi Jinping says, he's serious about Taiwan. But everybody was shocked to see Russia invade Ukraine, and then they were shocked because the Russian army and the Russian military performed so poorly. The convoy getting stuck on the way to Kiev and all this kind of stuff. Again, a laugh out of a bad comedy movie. But so and there'd been all this publicity about how the Russians were changing the military structure. They were getting rid of Soviet doctrine, that you had to check all the way up the line and before you took a hill, and then by the time you got it all the way back, the opportunity to take the hill was gone, and so forth. And that they put a lot of money into reforming Russian military systems and materiel and all that. Well, of course, as we found out, it was all a lie. It was Potemkin village, and all the money had gone into the accounts of generals and other officials in Switzerland. And we didn't really talk about corruption, but it's a fascinating topic. But to sum it all up, I don't think that there's been a time in any of our lives, of those of us now living, unless there's somebody still living who lived right before World War I, and there can't be many more than 100 years ago. I don't think there's any time in living memory where we faced so much uncertainty and so many risks from so many directions. And it may be that there is no time in history that we. So what comes next? I think you have to expect the unexpected. And I think the way to prepare for that is to do that, and to take sensible precautions, and to monitor the things, and only worry about and try to change the things you can affect, because most of it you can't, but you can some. And so pay attention.
Well said. Well said. And Dee, I can't thank you enough. Great conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed having you on, and we've had a lot of these conversations in the past, just you and I. And I think I've told you, you're one of two people that I read. Ray Dalio and you.
Thank you.
Your documentaries, your articles, or everything are fantastic. So I definitely encourage people to read those and get to know more about the research that you're doing, because it's really phenomenal, and I enjoy your viewpoint. Of course, I'm going to have a recording of this that goes out for anyone that might have missed it or wants to watch it again or share. And Dee, I'll be sure to include your contact information on that for people that would like to get in touch with you. But again, thank you very much. I mean, it's a huge honor to have you here and to hear your viewpoint. And I know everyone in the audience certainly appreciated it.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and I enjoyed it very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And I will follow up shortly with that video, and you'll also see it, or recording of this webinar video, and you'll also see it posted on the YouTube channel, so you can catch it there. And hope everyone has a great day, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
The webinar has ended. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.